Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we have Marchesa, the Black Rose. This deck comes to us by Lumeus, who says they're looking for general advice. No particular win cons outside of combat damage, though, could use some direction. He said they tried making this within a slim budget as a challenge, would like to keep it that way, although curious to see what a higher budget option can do to improve. Micaeus is definitely one I'm aware of already. Well, if you're already aware of Micaeus, I probably won't suggest it, but absolutely will try to stay within a budget. Well, thank you for the deck. And before we take a look, this is just your reminder that this deck list is in the video description below. Though this Marchesa is not my favorite Marchesa, as Queen Marchesa in Mardu is my favorite by far, Marchesa of the Black Rose is definitely still a very, very strong and fun commander. Especially something that I should try because I do really like the character, and I am pretty low on blue decks, so this might be a nice excuse to put some blue into my commander games. Also, looking at this deck, if you think of anything I haven't said, I'd love if you put a comment below. And just as a reminder, if you want to submit your own, deck list to me so I can take a look, there is a form in the video description below, and there is a link to bringing your deck to the front of the line should you want your deck to be the next one I look at. All right, let's take a look at Marchesa the Black Rose. So who is she and why are we using her as our commander? Well, she's 4 mana in Grixis colors, blue, black, red. She's a human wizard and a 3/3. She has Dethrone that says whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, it gains a +1/+1 counter. Other creatures also gain Dethrone, other creatures you control, I should say. And then when a creature you control dies, and it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to your battlefield under your control at the beginning of your next end step. This is really powerful for a number of reasons. One, it basically reanimates every single one of your creatures that has a +1/+1 counter on it. But also, something that's very notable and the deck builder has noticed is that it says under your control, not under its owner's control. So if you were to steal a creature from an opponent, get it a +1/+1 counter, such as, using that dethrone ability or that, generally just putting a counter on it, and then it were to die, you would regain that creature instead of your opponent, which is really, really powerful. As a brief note on Dethrone, unlike something like Brina, who is my commander that cares about max life total, Dethrone actually counts all players' life totals. So if you have the highest life, Dethrone objectively does nothing. So you should be careful with that, right? Also, like when you're going to attacks is the last point that an opponent can interfere with this. So just be careful if they have fetch lands, if they're playing red, they might be able to put a situation to leave you with the highest health, which can be tricky when you're relying on that dethrone for +1/+1 counters. All right, let's take a look at the deck itself. Quickly, I'm going to go down to our mana curve. Our mana curve is pretty nice little curve here. We look at our 9-drop. As always, we're in red, so it is Blasphemous Act, which is not a 9-mana spell, so that's perfect. Let's look at our 8-mana spell, and it is Insurrection as our big finisher for the deck. We will come back to Insurrection, but for now, I want to point out that I'm never too upset with one giant mana spell in a deck. It is fun to have spells like this, especially insurrection style spells that threaten to win the entire game in one attack. Very, very strong, very much worth the 8 mana it represents, so no problem here. But as viewers of the channel know, when we have a 4 mana commander, we need to look at our 4 mana cards because a lot of these cards may compete or be in the way of our commander, right? When we have a 4 mana commander and our hand is filled with 4 mana cards, we're in kind of a tricky situation. So let's take a look, let's be a little picky on them and see what we can do. Though I will take a moment to point out that it feels like when I give this example and I talk about commanders and having spells at the same mana cost, the number that seems to be the most problematic is usually 4, and then I would say either 3 or 5 a little bit. I think it's just commonly known that these are the average mana costs a few turns into the game. Well, with mana rocks or how quickly a format can become, around 4 or 5 mana is kind of the sweet spot for like really strong spells that aren't too expensive. And I would say that's the sweet spot for a lot of really strong commanders. I personally love commanders on lower mana costs, but a lot of the really good ones start at 4 mana or 5 mana. And with that in mind, those are the numbers we're going to be looking at the most and being the most picky with. For example, I just built an Ashnod deck at 1 mana. Your 1 mana commander, I'm still playing tons of 1 mana cards, right? The rule mostly applies when your commander is 3 to 5 mana. All right, so let's take a look at what we have. Cytoplasm Manipulator is a creature that says, it has graph 2, so it comes in with 2 counters. Then when you play another creature, it can give its counter to something else. And then for 1 blue, you can gain control of a creature that has a +1/+1 counter. Now, this card represents a really high ceiling. It has a lot that it's very showy, right? It just does so much, and it guarantees your next creature has a +1/+1 counter. If you steal a creature with a +1/+1 counter and Marchesa is out in play and that creature dies, you get that creature permanently, regardless if Cytoplasm Manipulator is, on the field or not. But I'm going to suggest this is all just kind of too much work, right? Like, one, it's the same mana cost as our commander. Two, it has 2 abilities that are kind of gate kept either by having to being able to summon another creature to use the graft, or by waiting for the entire turn cycle for you to get this creature back, and then untap with this creature and use its ability. Like, the ceiling's high, but the floor is really, really low. As a reminder, when Marchesa brings our creatures back, they're still going to have summoning sickness, so we still need for them to continue an entire turn cycle, right? So even though technically this creature will never die, because it always, like, quote unquote never die, because it always comes back with its own +1/+1 counters, all of these things I don't think add up to, this card is not greater than the sum of its parts. It's too many hoops to jump through, and everything it does is kind of okay, you know. The other problem is like if you have Cytoplasm Manipulator and then you try to gain control of a creature and your opponent destroys that Cytoplasm Manipulator, yes, you will get it back with Marchesa out, but you won't get the creature, right? Because Cytoplasm Manipulator is now a different card, and therefore you don't get to keep it. It's clunky, I think is my point to say. All right, moving on. Erebus. Erebus is interesting. I don't think it belongs here. I do like the fact that whenever you can use it to draw cards and it stops your opponents from gaining life, but you kind of do want them to gain life for the dethrone effect. And once again, if you're playing it for the life gain, sorry, the stopping of life gain, there's other cards you can play. And if you're playing it for the card draw, there's also other cards that you can play that both do not cost 4 mana. Because of that, I don't like Erebos here, and I think we should cut them. Glen Elendra Archmage. So Glen Elendra Archmage is tricky because we have to remember that in order to make her work, her ceiling, once again, much like the Cytoplasm Manipulator, is really, really strong. The idea is that you play her, or you play the Archmage, you then counter a spell for 1 blue. It persists, so it returns with a -1/-1 counter. And then, if you put a +1/+1 counter on it, you set it back to neutral. You don't actually need that second +1/+1 because it has persist already, and therefore you can just endlessly cycle Glen Elendra Archmage. However, this just feels, once again, a little clunky. To say that you can infinitely cycle Glen Elendra Archmage isn't true. You do need ways to put +1/+1 counters on her, And the way your opponents are going to deal with her is by repeatedly targeting her or targeting Marchesa and putting you in a situation where there's just not a clean way to put a counter on this. And also something worth mentioning is that its activation does cost a blue, and that's really real. And so once this quote unquote lock is put into play, where you can endlessly counter your opponent's non-creature spells, in theory, your opponents are going to band together and find a turn in order to just stop this from happening, right? They're going to wait until you have a limited amount of blue up, and they're going to do what they can to stop, just shut down this kind of combo. And there's a lot of ways they can do that, from like rest in peace effects to targeted removal to, defeating you, for example. So for the effort to put this together, I don't think it's necessarily worth it. It's not the worst, but I think it's not the best either. Hostage Taker is interesting because it is both removal and you get to cast that creature from underneath the Hostage Taker. I think I'm warmer to this card than the others because the ceiling is high, but the floor is pretty high too. Because you can just play Hostage Taker, right? And just like tuck a creature underneath it, and just have no intention of ever casting that creature, right? Then if Hostage Taker gets a +1/+1 counter on it, it represents the fact that if it leaves play, it'll come back into play and take that same creature again. And I think that floor is pretty good. The ceiling being that you keep casting the creature that's underneath Hostage Taker and keep resummoning the Hostage Taker when it dies with a +1/+1 counter. I do really like that. So I like Hostage Taker, and I think it's definitely worth keeping here. Murderous Redcap goes infinite with a number of things in this deck, so absolutely play this card. This is one of the best cards in your deck. I find it interesting that you said you're looking for general advice. No particular win cons outside of combat damage, though, could use some direction. That's interesting to me because you're playing Murderous Redcap. You're already playing a lot of non-combat damage win cons, so I don't know what you mean by this because you're already doing it. I think maybe you meant like Thassa's Oracle wins, where you are circumventing life totals entirely, but I leave that up to you to decide. I'll still make the suggestions that I think match the flavor of your deck of what's already in there, and I won't be including anything otherwise. All this to say, Murder Spread Cap is insane in this deck. So, so strong and definitely worth playing. Profaner of the Dead is really interesting. I'm looking at this card. You exploit a creature with high toughness, and then all your opponent's creatures are bounced. That's creatures they control and not own, so you keep the ones you've stolen. But I'm having a hard time trying to pinpoint, these are considering, exactly what that number is. So, like Erebros, I think is the highest toughness in the deck. And everything else, like we cap out at kind of 3 most of the time. And so, with that in mind, I don't think this is good enough. I think it feels really good. I think with a +1/+1 counter, that's 4, and it feels like it should hit a lot. And if one of your opponents is playing tokens, this can do a lot. But I think a lot of the time, this is just going to miss, the things you really want to hit. I'm thinking about, once again, I'll think of my Brina deck, that where, my Brina grows very, very easily into like a 5/7 or something like that. And so I'm not too worried about you bouncing it using this effect. Likewise, if I think of, my Atraxa Blink deck, I'm really fine with you bouncing all my creatures back into hand. That's actually kind of intended. And by the fact that you have limited control over it because your numbers only go so high, I don't know. This feels really clunky and I don't particularly like it. Sad Robot, Solemn Simulacrum is really interesting, though he doesn't look as sad as he used to, and I think that's kind of cool. I still don't know if it belongs here. I think it is a really high upside, don't get me wrong. Being able to get Solemn Simulacrum back onto the battlefield every turn, if you can keep putting +1/+1 counters on it, is really, really good. That being said, it is tricky, right? And it's still the same mana cost as your commander. And even if you do it 2 or 3 times, is that really that good versus a lot of the other cards? Like, for example, if you reanimate something like, if we go up here, Kokusho, right? You're stealing upwards of 45 life if you do this 3 times. Whereas Solemn Simulacrum, which takes the same kind of effort to do this, is really not, you know, it's just putting you slowly ahead. Ahead with 3 lands and 3 cards, but I don't know if that's worth the effort. Now, I want to be clear. I'm implying that you can't do this infinitely. Because if you can do this infinitely, yeah, it's really good because you draw your entire deck. But you remember, Marchesa only triggers once per end step. So with something like, Kakusho, a 3 end steps in a row is really, really good, and Solemn Simulacrum is not so much. Now, if you were doing something else that allowed for infinite, reanimations in one turn, then obviously the robot is very, very good. But so is every other card in your deck. So with that in mind, I'm just a little minus on this card. It's just too close to our mana cost, and I don't love it. All right, let's come to the last few. Sword of Temptation is interesting. I think you play this or Hostage Taker, but I don't think you play both. Obviously, the perk is Sword of Temptation just takes the creature, end of story, whereas the Hostage Taker, you need to cast the creature, but when you lose the Sword of Temptation, you lose the creature, and so there is a bit of a cost there. So I think you play one of two. I don't think you play both. If this ability was on a 5 mana card, I wouldn't be scrutinizing it so hard. It's just that it's at 4 mana, which matches our commander. So with that in mind, play one of them, but don't play both. Spark Double is really, 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 really cool. I really like it here. I don't think I really need to explain why. The fact that it comes in with its own +1/+1 counter and can be anything is all I need to know. Absolutely keep it. You're going to have a lot of fun with this card. So absolutely love it. Thought Sponge says, Thought Sponge is interesting. Thought Sponge is interesting. I don't like it though. I think it's really, really tricky to make work here. You gotta really squeeze that sponge, my goodness, in order to get the most out of it. I don't think it's really, really good because basically all the stars have to align for Thought Sponge to come in as a 5/5. Otherwise, you can just play Thought Sponge and grow it naturally, and then when you sacrifice it, you know, it will die and come back and you draw some cards. Once again, if it wasn't 4 mana, I'd be a lot easier on it, but at 4 mana with this ability, I don't particularly love it. Finally, Lethal Scheme is fine because of Convoke. So there's a few more cards I want to really briefly touch on before I go into the additions, and they are as thus. A few of these cards like Banewhip Punisher and Bloodflow Connoisseur feel weak for what they do. They seem just okay, and I think there's better options for both. Likewise, there was another one that I saw. I won't be able to find it here, but okay, I'll get back to these. I will say for our removal, we're missing a few removal cards that I think you would benefit from. Just like the classics of Lightning Bolt, Rapid Hybridization, and Pongify are the really good 1 mana removal spells in these colors. Black, once we go to second 2 mana and we have Infernal Grasp, is really, really good. But the other one that I want here, and you are playing, is Feed the Swarm, because the ability to just get rid of Rest in Peace is really, really important. So you are playing that, but I think you could benefit from a few 1 mana cards. But the last thing I'm going to note is you are low on lands. You do have 33, 34 lands, and I wouldn't mind you going up to like 35. If you can find any cuts here or there for just 1 or 2 lands, I think you will be really happy. All right, Insurrection. We got to talk about Insurrection, and then I will say my suggestions. Insurrection is an interesting card. I think this card is going to be either really, really good or just okay. And I'm going to suggest 2 cards to maybe replace it to make it a little consistent. Insurrection is a really fun card. When it is good, it is so, so, so good. And with the right board state, you can not only steal those creatures, you can steal them back permanently. by using Dethrone to put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on those creatures or other +1/+1 counter effects, and then sacrifice all of those to one of your sacrifice outlets. And by doing that, you get to keep all those creatures. Really, really cool. Some people think Insurrection is bad. I just want to take a moment. They get angry that they feel like it's a win out of nowhere. And I really don't understand that sentiment. They say, well, you didn't do anything, and you play Insurrection and you just win. And I think that's so short-sighted. Like, you have to get to 8 mana. That's not free in a game of Commander. You have to actually be playing the game the whole time. The second of all, you have to wait for a situation for Insurrection to be good, which is not all the time. And especially in higher power setups, boards aren't that big. You might see situations where each player has 2 to 3 creatures, which are individually very strong, but not very wide and not enough to just defeat your opponents all at once. So Insurrection does take a lot of skill and a lot of, you know, playing around certain situations for it to be good. That being said, Insurrection is completely dependent on your opponent's board. So there's 2 cards that I think are worth considering as side grades or cards that do almost the same thing. One of them is Rise of the Dark Realms. Rise of the Dark Realms is just universally a good card. It's 1 more mana, unfortunately, but it reanimates every single card on the battlefield. Now, these cards are more open to Rest in Peace effects, so if that is a worry, don't go into these 2 cards I'm suggesting. But Rise of the Dark Realms does what it says on the tin, just a little better than Insurrection, because graveyards, especially your graveyard, will be a place full of creatures, right? And Rise from the Dark Realms will take all of those, give them all to you. A lot of these creatures that you steal will have an ETB then and there. And then later, if you are able to put a counter on them, you can get an additional ETP. So that can be very, very helpful. But the other one I'm going to say is Grave Betrayal, which is a card, oops, which is a card I really, really like, and I have it in my like binder somewhere, and I just never take it out. I don't find decks where this is the final card I want to play, but it's so so good, right? 7 mana. Whenever a creature dies and you don't control it, return it onto your control with a +1/+1 counter. It is a zombie in addition to its other types. So this is kind of like a copy of Marchesa, right? Because it triggers once a turn, and it triggers the reanimation happens on the next end step, so you can only really do it once a turn. But it's just so good. It's just so 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 good. You play this, and if anyone plays a board wipe, you're in an amazing position. You play this against aristocrats, you're in an amazing position. This card is 7 mana, so it's 1 less than Insurrection. It still works badly against Rest in Peace, but otherwise is just such a strong card. I would heavily recommend this as an option, but I leave that to you. The point is, all of these cards are your biggest cards to cast, and whichever one you end up casting is the one you're going to like the most. All right, so what are my additions I'd like to suggest? Well, the first one is nice and easy, and it's Feign Death effects. So Feign Death and Undying Malice are the most straightforward ones, which say that when a creature dies, it returns back to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Now, this is really, really good for you because it does 2 things. One, it emulates your commander's effect, so you can get an additional way to get this. Two, it doesn't require the creature to have a +1/+1 counter, so even if you have your commander out, you'll still get the creature back. And three, and most importantly, it puts a +1/+1 counter on it. So you can feign death a creature, get it back immediately, sacrifice it again, and get another trigger off Marchesa at the end of the turn. All of this is really, really strong, and I think they're really easy inclusions. It really depends how many you want. Undying Evil is the next one, but as you might know, Undying works differently because it gives the ability Undying, which means if the creature dies with a +1/+1 counter, it doesn't actually come back, so it is weaker than the other two. And then Malakir Rebirth is nice because it is a land on the back, but it does not put a +1/+1 counter. I would definitely recommend this, probably the first, as you would benefit from another land, but it itself is just a really strong ability. After that, I have a few more suggestions. I'll get the boring ones out of the way first. The Saraseer Viscera, my goodness, Viscera is fantastic. Just I always, if you're playing Carrion Feeder and you're playing a deck that wants to sacrifice, play this card. It is much better than Bloodflow Connoisseur. Yes, itself doesn't come back because it doesn't put +1/+1 counters, but that's not the point. It is a third of the mana of that card. So have this guy out, have him eat your creatures. You'll be incredibly happy. The scry is relevant. The instant speed sacrifice is relevant. You're going to have a great time. Nice and easy. Second, another maybe a little more of a boring addition is Read the Bones. I just think you'd benefit from another copy of Read the Bones. It just got reprinted. I might take $5, $10 and buy every copy of Read the Bones I possibly can sometime soon because I mean, it's just a great card. You're just really, really happy having copies of this card. Every Black Commander deck, almost outside of like very high power, will be really happy to run this card. Just go ahead and grab the copies you can. All right, let's look. Midnight Reaper feels noticeably absent from your deck. I just think it would be beneficial here. If you're already playing, let me see, the other version of it. You're already playing Morbid Opportunist. I think Midnight Reaper is the stronger of the two. So I would play Midnight Reaper first and then Morbid Opportunist second. So if you're playing it in the other direction, definitely play this as well. This card continues to be dirt cheap and is just such a powerful card. So very, very happy to see a card like this just at any point in any of these kinds of decks. So absolutely play it, absolutely have a good time. I think it is a great, great inclusion. Then, and this was the card I wasn't sure about, Gary, Grey Merchant of Asphodel. You said no non-combat damage, but you're playing Kokusho and you're playing Madcap, so I want to suggest this. It's in the same vein as those two cards. I think you'll be very, very happy to play this card. I leave it to you. It is just a very, very strong card that can swing life totals in an incredibly quickly way. Remember that if you have Queen Marchesa up and then just two black pips anywhere, it's Kakusho. In fact, if you have Kakusho out, those are the two black pips that you need. But Gary or Grey Merchant is really good because it's on ETB as opposed to being on death. And therefore, if you have the setup, you can just have him come in turn after turn after turn, and you're just going to have a great time. Finally, I will suggest that this card combos really, really well with Spark Double. But then when I think about it, so does Kakusho. Spark Double is just one of the strongest cards in the deck. And Spark Doubling either of those cards, you're just going to have such a great time. Spark Doubling Kakusho and letting it die to the Legendary rule and then returning it over and over again is very, very funny to me. All right, my last suggestion to wrap up the deck assist is, in fact, the Nazgul. The Nazgul are really funny here. Am I actually 100% advocating for the Nazgul? Probably not, to be honest. I think it's kind of silly, but I think it's silly fun. Maybe not this deck, but there could definitely be Marchesa, the Black Rose Nazgul deck, right? They do everything Marchesa wants to do. They put a +1/+1 counter on themselves, and they have a really like useful ETB. So if you can get like two Nazguls out and then you just start sacrificing one of them per turn, the other one is going to be massive. If you have three Nazgul out and you're doing the same thing, you're even happier. If you somehow get in a situation where you have enough Nazgul that you can sacrifice two Nazguls a turn, my goodness, you're just in a really, really good situation, right? This is one of those cards that exponentially grows, where every Nazgul sees the trigger, and so the more Nazgul you have, and the more Nazgul that come in, you're just having a great time. Maybe that's not exponential. I use that word a lot. All right, those are my suggestions. You are by looking at this deck, I do really want to play Marchesa, the Black Rose. Like it does look like a lot of fun. It's almost like a Grixis Blink deck, and that already catches my attention. It has an Aristocrats kind of setup. I gotta not convince myself into this because I'm gonna need a mana base for this, and I don't have much of a blue mana base. So I'll end the video there. I hope this deck assist was helpful to you. Thank you so much for sending your deck. And if you'd like to send another draft of this deck or any deck, there is a link in the video description where you can send that deck. Also, if you want your deck to be the next deck I look at, there is a link that allows you to bring the deck to the front of the list, let's say. All right. Oh, yes. Like, comment, subscribe. You know that whole thing. All right. Good luck.